Karen Alexander graced the runway alongside the greatest models of her era, yet her journey was marked by a different narrative. Where many were uplifted, she was too often ignored and overlooked, simply because of the color of her skin. What was the real cost she endured in fashion's relentless industry? Discover the untold truth of the supermodel. Karen Alexander's story in fashion carries a meaning that goes far beyond the runway. It is not only about a model who appeared on glossy covers and walked in glamorous shows, but also about what her career represents in the history of Black women in fashion. She stood tall at a time when opportunities were limited, and her presence itself became a quiet act of courage. In an industry that rarely celebrated women who looked like her, Karen carved a space with her talent, grace, and determination. Her journey was not without struggle, but it left behind lessons that remain valuable today. For Black women in fashion, Karen's career was both a mirror and a signal. It reflected the challenges of being overlooked, but it also signaled what was possible when doors opened even slightly. She worked during a time when only a handful of Black models were allowed into the spotlight, often treated as exceptions rather than equals. Yet she proved that beauty and talent did not have a single face or a single definition. In this way, she became part of a larger story of resilience and progress for women of color who dreamed of entering the same field. By walking in shows, appearing in magazines, and standing beside her peers with quiet strength, Karen helped make it easier for later generations to step forward. Her presence, even when not always celebrated, laid the groundwork for younger models of color who would not have to fight the same battles alone. Today, when the industry makes space for models with darker skin tones, natural hair, and unique features, it is in part because of pioneers like her. Though she may not have been given the title of supermodel in the same way as her white peers, she helped shift the lens through which beauty was seen. Looking at the fashion world today, it is clear that some things have changed while others remain the same. Diversity is now a word the industry uses proudly, with the runways featuring models from many backgrounds. Campaigns now highlight a wider range of skin tones, body shapes, and identities. Yet, beneath these changes, the struggle for equal recognition still exists. Black models are still often fewer in number compared to white models, and many still feel the pressure of tokenism. The progress made owes much to trailblazers like Karen, but her story also reminds us that true equality is not yet fully here. Karen's legacy is bittersweet. On one hand, she stood out in her time, achieving feats many young women dreamed of but could not reach. On the other hand, she was not celebrated as much as she should have been, often left out of the glamorous stories that shaped the idea of the supermodel era. When Karen Alexander stepped into the world of fashion in the early 1980s, she entered a place that was dazzling on the surface but full of unspoken barriers underneath. Modeling at the time promised glamour, wealth, and fame, but for a young Black woman, it was also a battleground where acceptance came slowly and opportunities were tightly controlled. Fashion houses, magazines, and casting agents celebrated beauty, but only when it fit within the narrow boundaries of Eurocentric ideals. Into this carefully guarded world came Karen Alexander, a woman with striking features, a graceful figure, and a quiet determination that would allow her to stand shoulder to shoulder with some of the most recognizable faces of her generation. Karen's first steps into modeling were not simple. The early 1980s was still a period when the number of Black models being signed to major agencies was very small. Those who managed to break through often had to work twice as hard to earn the same recognition as their white counterparts. When Karen entered the scene, she had to navigate these obstacles while trying to prove that her look was not only unique, but also powerful enough to command the same respect given to the established faces dominating magazine covers. Despite the narrow gatekeeping of the industry, Karen's natural talent was undeniable. Within a short time of entering the modeling world, she was noticed by agencies that saw the sharpness of her cheekbones, the warmth of her skin tone, and the poise she carried both on and off camera. These qualities set her apart, and though fashion still resisted giving full acceptance to Black models, Karen began to build momentum. Her initial assignments were small, but they were enough to place her in front of photographers who would later become instrumental in advancing her career. The real breakthrough came when she landed appearances in major magazines like Vogue and Elle. At the time, such features were considered golden opportunities for any aspiring model. But for a Black model, they carried even greater weight. To appear in those glossy spreads meant being placed in a space where representation was scarce. Every page turned by a reader who saw Karen was more than just a picture. It was a statement that Black beauty could not be ignored. These early moments gave Karen visibility and began carving her name into the growing conversation about diversity in fashion. While Karen was rising, the industry already had a few Black icons. Beverly Johnson had made history in the 1970s, when she became the first Black woman to grace the cover of American Vogue. Iman, with her regal elegance and magnetic presence, had brought African beauty into the spotlight and was considered a muse for major designers. Naomi Campbell, who came slightly after Karen, was pushing through the barriers with force and would eventually become one of the most famous supermodels in the world. Against this backdrop, Karen Alexander emerged as part of a small but significant wave of Black women who dared to stand in front of the camera and insist that their beauty was not secondary. What made Karen's presence significant was not just her talent, but also the timing of her rise. The early to mid-1980s was still an era when fashion magazines often limited themselves to one Black model per issue, as though representation had to be rationed. Runways in Paris, Milan, and New York featured very few women of color, and even when they did, those women were often selected only if their looks could be styled in ways that seemed acceptable to predominantly white audiences. Karen Alexander stepped onto this stage with a look that could not be hidden or muted. Her rich features, her confident walk, and her aura were impossible to deny. In this way, she became part of the subtle but powerful shift toward broadening the standards of beauty. By the mid to late 1980s, Karen was not just appearing in magazines, but was also walking for major designers and featuring in campaigns that reached international audiences. These years marked her rapid rise to fame. She stood alongside some of the top names in the business, sharing runways with faces that defined the decade. Designers appreciated her ability to transform clothes into art with her elegant presence, and photographers admired how the camera seemed to adore her from every angle. The term supermodel was beginning to gain weight during this period. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, the supermodel era had fully taken hold, and models were no longer just silent figures showcasing clothing. They had become cultural icons, household names, and even businesswomen commanding massive paychecks. Karen Alexander belonged to this generation, contributing to the explosion of modeling into mainstream fame. She represented an important piece of this puzzle, showing that Black women had a rightful place among the highest ranks of modeling. Her career is dotted with success stories that highlighted her versatility and her ability to appeal to both high fashion and commercial clients. She worked with some of the most respected photographers of her time, standing in front of lenses that would later define fashion history. She walked the runways of Paris, Milan, and New York, dressed in creations that audiences would remember long after the shows ended. Campaigns for luxury brands placed her in advertisements seen around the world, solidifying her status as a global face of beauty. Each assignment added another layer to her profile and gave her the recognition she had fought for since stepping into the industry. Yet, even as she was admired for her striking look, Karen did not always receive the same visibility or recognition as white supermodels. While some of her peers were celebrated endlessly, with their faces plastered on billboards and covers across the globe, Karen's presence was often muted by an industry that still hesitated to fully embrace diversity. She was respected, she was noticed, and she was admired, but the opportunities handed to her were not always equal. This imbalance revealed the reality of fashion at the time. Even the most talented Black models often had to watch as their careers were restricted, not by lack of skill, but by systemic bias. Karen's journey through the 1980s was both inspiring and bittersweet. On one hand, she achieved what many young models could only dream of: covers of major magazines, prestigious runway shows, and campaigns that paid homage to her beauty. On the other hand, she carried the weight of being part of a group of women constantly forced to prove themselves in a world that often refused to see them as equals. The significance of her story lies in how she carved space where there had been so little before. Karen Alexander's breakthrough was not just about her own career, but about a broader movement within fashion. Every time she appeared on a cover or walked a runway, she represented more than herself. She symbolized the possibility for other Black women to step into the spotlight and be celebrated not as exceptions, but as equals. Her rise in the mid to late 1980s placed her firmly in the conversation about who defined beauty at that time. While magazines and fashion houses were slow to change, her visibility challenged the stereotypes and forced a rethinking of what fashion could look like. Her work with top designers and photographers expanded her influence and left an imprint that would influence the generations of models who came after her. But what exactly were the challenges that gave Karen the limitations from going further in her career? Fashion in the 1980s and 1990s was glamorous, but beneath the shining runways and glossy covers was a harsh truth. The industry that claimed to celebrate beauty often practiced exclusion when it came to Black women. It was not always done openly. In many cases, the barriers were hidden behind polite excuses, unspoken rules, and decisions made in private meetings. Karen Alexander, despite her stunning beauty and undeniable talent, found herself caught inside this system. She rose high enough to be recognized around the world, but not high enough to enjoy the same rewards that her white peers received. The unspoken rules of fashion casting were among the clearest signs of this quiet discrimination. At that time, many designers and casting agents operated with the belief that having more than one black model in a show or campaign would be too much. Diversity was treated as a token, not as a natural reflection of the world. If one black woman was selected, it often meant that others were automatically excluded, no matter how qualified they were. Even when she was chosen, the styling often carried stereotypes. Hairstylists and makeup artists, many of whom were trained only on white models, sometimes struggled to work with her skin tone or hair texture. Instead of adapting to her natural beauty, they forced her into looks that fit preconceived notions of how a black woman should appear. This kind of treatment chipped away at her chances to showcase her full range as a model. Pay disparities were another clear sign of inequality. Models who shared the same runways and photo shoots did not always receive the same paychecks. Black models, including Karen, were often paid less than white models of equal standing. Beyond money, there was also the issue of visibility. A white model might land several magazine covers in a year, while a black model of similar talent and reputation might be featured far less. Karen Alexander's appearances in top magazines like Vogue and Elle were impressive, but they were still fewer compared to what her white peers were offered. The difference was not about beauty or skill. It was about a system that valued whiteness as the standard and treated blackness as a rare alternative. The root of these problems lay in the industry's preference for a narrow Eurocentric standard of beauty. For decades, fashion had praised pale skin, straight hair, and delicate features as the ultimate ideal. When black women like Karen Alexander entered the picture, they were measured against this standard rather than being celebrated for their own unique attributes. Her high cheekbones, deep skin tone, and expressive eyes made her unforgettable. But the industry did not always allow those features to shine freely. Instead, casting directors often viewed her beauty as something exotic or unusual, not as central or universal. This attitude kept her from reaching the same heights as models who fit the Eurocentric mold more closely. The emotional toll of this struggle was heavy. Karen had to constantly prove herself, not just as a model, but as a representative of her race. Every time she walked a runway or posed for a camera, she knew that her performance would not only be judged against her peers, but also against the expectations of what a black woman in fashion should look like. This pressure was exhausting, and it left little room for mistakes. Where her white colleagues could afford to be experimental or even fail, Karen was expected to be flawless at all times. The weight of carrying such responsibility drained her emotionally, even as she smiled before the cameras. Systemic racism in fashion limited Karen's career opportunities despite her undeniable talent. It was not enough to have the right look, the right walk, or the right presence. The decisions made by those in power, designers, editors, photographers, and agents, were shaped by unspoken bias. They controlled who appeared on the most important covers, who walked the most prestigious runways, and who received the highest paying contracts. Karen's path was shaped by these hidden choices. She could rise, but she could never fully break through the ceiling that had been carefully placed above her. Staying relevant in such an environment was also difficult. Black models often found themselves celebrated briefly before being replaced by the next new face. The industry treated diversity like a trend rather than a permanent standard. Karen, like many of her peers, faced the challenge of being tokenized. She might be chosen to represent diversity in a particular season, but once that season passed, the attention shifted elsewhere. This cycle made it hard for her to maintain the kind of long-lasting career stability that many of her white colleagues enjoyed. Even Naomi Campbell, who eventually became a global icon, admitted that she too faced racism throughout her career. The difference was that Naomi had a level of support and visibility that allowed her to break through barriers in ways others could not. She had powerful allies in the industry who championed her relentlessly, and this support amplified her reach. Karen Alexander, while equally talented, did not have the same level of backing. Without the same network of advocates, her path was harder and her opportunities fewer. This difference in support explains why Karen did not sustain the same level of fame, even though her abilities were not less. The truth is that Karen Alexander possessed every quality needed to stand among the top names of her era. She had the look, the presence, and the professionalism. What she lacked was an industry willing to value her fully. The hidden personal sacrifices she endured were many. She gave her time, her energy, and her heart to an industry that often refused to meet her halfway. She traveled constantly, adapted to the demands of different markets, and carried herself with grace even when she was overlooked. She poured herself into a profession that demanded everything, but did not always return the same in reward. Her story shows how subtle racism can shape a career without ever being openly acknowledged. No one told Karen directly that she was excluded because of her skin color. But the patterns were clear. Limited magazine covers, lower pay, stereotypical styling, fewer campaigns, and the need to constantly prove herself. All of these were signs of an industry that was not ready to embrace Black beauty on equal terms. The barriers were invisible to many, but they were painfully real for those who lived through them. Karen Alexander's career unfolded during a golden era of fashion. Yet the way it was remembered and recorded tells another story. The media played a central role in shaping who was celebrated and who was forgotten. In glossy magazines, television specials, and endless retrospectives, certain names became immortalized as the faces of the supermodel era. Others, despite walking the same runways and appearing in the same campaigns, were quietly placed in the background. Karen was one of those who often found her achievements hidden behind the glow of her white peers. When the media covered her career, the tone was very different compared to the way it celebrated models who fit the traditional standard of beauty. White supermodels were placed on the covers of magazines again and again, with long features written about their personalities, lifestyles, and power. They became household names because the press gave them endless attention. Karen Alexander, on the other hand, was often presented only in relation to the clothes she wore. Her personal story and her influence were rarely given the same platform. Even though she was present in major magazines like Vogue and Elle, her appearances were not framed as groundbreaking achievements, but as simple additions to fashion spreads. The lack of storytelling around her career meant that her place in the industry was never cemented in the same way. This unequal coverage created gaps in how the history of supermodels was later told. When people look back on the late 1980s and early 1990s, they often speak of the same group of famous names. These women are remembered not only for their beauty, but for the myth that was built around them. Karen was working in the very same circles, appearing on the same runways, photographed by the same celebrated names, yet she was not included in the mainstream narratives of the time. The label supermodel was given generously to some, but sparingly to others. Karen's exclusion showed that the term was not always based on talent or success, but also on which stories the media chose to amplify. The erasure of her contributions was part of a larger pattern. Fashion history has often downplayed or overlooked the impact of Black models. Even when they made significant strides, their names were not carried forward with the same enthusiasm. Magazines and fashion critics highlighted their presence in the moment, but once the season passed, their stories faded. This was not only about Karen. Many Black models from her generation faced the same quiet dismissal. Their work was crucial in pushing the industry toward diversity, but the media rarely treated them as lasting icons. Major fashion retrospectives showed this clearly. When documentaries, coffee table books, and anniversary specials revisited the era of supermodels, Karen Alexander's name was often absent. Images of her might appear in group shots or runway clips, but the spotlight rarely landed on her individually. Retrospectives praised the famous faces of fashion and listed the same group of names repeatedly, while voices like Karen's were brushed aside. This selective memory reinforced the idea that only a handful of women defined the age, even though the reality was far broader and richer. The effect of this erasure is still felt today. Because she was not consistently celebrated by the media during her peak, her legacy does not carry the same weight as her white counterparts. Younger generations of fashion fans often know the same few supermodel names, but remain unaware of Karen Alexander's important role. The lack of recognition does not erase her actual achievements, but it shapes public memory in a way that makes her story less visible. This is one of the most painful outcomes of media erasure. It does not remove the work itself, but it dims its light for future audiences. Behind the lights, cameras, and applause of fashion shows, Karen Alexander carried burdens that the public never saw. To most, she was a vision of elegance, stepping onto runways and appearing in glossy spreads with effortless grace. Yet beyond those images was a woman who battled daily to hold her place in an industry that often left little space for her. Her struggles were not only professional but also deeply personal, touching her mind, her emotions, and her spirit. Karen's biggest challenge was visibility. She had the beauty, skill, and professionalism of a world-class model, but she constantly had to fight for attention in a system that did not naturally embrace her. The industry operated with rules that placed Black models in the background. She could walk the same shows as her peers, work with the same photographers, and appear in the same magazines, yet she would often be remembered less. This constant fight for recognition weighed heavily on her. It was not about talent, because she had more than enough of it. It was about pushing against a wall that never seemed to move, no matter how hard she tried. The mental toll of that fight was significant. Fashion had little room for vulnerability. Models were expected to appear perfect at all times. Perfect skin, perfect body, perfect smile. For white models, a mistake or a bad season could be forgiven because the industry was quick to give them another chance. For Karen, the pressure was doubled. She knew that one slip could reinforce the unspoken belief that black models did not belong at the top. The need to constantly prove her worth left little room for rest or weakness. Behind her confident walk was a woman carrying the heavy weight of expectation. Emotionally, this lack of room for error could be exhausting. Every show and every shoot came with the unspoken demand to outshine others simply to be considered equal. Instead of celebrating her presence, she often had to remind the industry why she deserved to be there. That kind of pressure does not fade after the lights go out. It follows a person into their private life, into quiet moments when they wonder if all the effort will ever be enough. Karen carried those thoughts, even while continuing to smile for the cameras. The lack of representation also affected her career's longevity. In fashion, visibility determines survival. The models who stay in the spotlight are the ones who secure longer careers, more contracts, and more recognition. Because black models were not consistently represented, their careers often burned brightly for a few seasons and then dimmed. Karen faced this cycle. Despite her immense talent, the absence of consistent representation made it difficult for her to maintain the kind of long-term presence enjoyed by many white models of her generation. She had the ability to stand among the greats, but the system did not allow her to hold that space for as long as she deserved. Her struggles reflected broader issues facing many black models of that era. They were all part of a group that worked within an industry that admired their beauty when it suited fashion trends, but quickly turned away when it no longer needed to appear diverse. They were celebrated briefly, often as tokens, then set aside while the spotlight shifted back to the familiar faces that fit the Eurocentric mold. For Karen and others like her, this meant constantly living on the edge of invisibility, never knowing if the next season would bring opportunity or silence. Karen's story reveals the human side of modeling that rarely makes headlines. It shows the loneliness of being admired on paper but overlooked in reality, of being praised for beauty while denied the same opportunities as peers. Beyond the runway, she was a woman navigating an industry that demanded perfection without offering security. She gave everything, her time, her energy, and her heart, while knowing that the rewards would never be equal to the sacrifices.